Good evening. I am pleased to welcome you to this evening's Public Information Evening on Civil Unions. My name is Aderonka Badamosi Wilson, and I am the moderator for this event. The agenda for our time together is we'll have remarks from the Minister for Community, Culture, and Sports, the Honorable Patricia Gordon Pamplin, JP MP. She will be followed by the Attorney General and Minister for Legal Affairs, the Honorable Trevor Moniz, JP MP. The Minister for Home Affairs, Senator the Honorable Michael Fahey, JP, is not with us this evening, but he will join us for Monday's session. We also have with us Ms. Jane Brett, who is the Acting Director for Human Affairs. Ladies and gentlemen, I will ask you to save your questions until the end of the formal presentation. We'll have time for questions and comments at that point, and before we start that, I'll come back and give you the rules by which we'll work with for the questions. I now invite Minister Gordon Pamplin to the podium.
Welcome to the first of two sessions on the proposal for establishing civil unions in Bermuda in terms of the discussion and the feedback that we intend to engage in. In the fall of last year, the Department of Human Affairs and the Ministry of Community, Culture, and Sport hosted 2 information sessions on same-sex marriage. We shared our research on what was happening in other jurisdictions and how they had embraced or rejected the idea. At the end of the evening, the public was invited to make submissions to the ministry's email address by the 30th of October. Both meetings were extremely well attended, and there were many submissions that included heart-rending experiences, ranging from a desire to protect the church and its principles to the passionate pleas by those who wanted to have the right to marry irrespective of their sexual orientation. Many written submissions were also received, and since those meetings, I have read and analyzed all of them and have had discussions with leaders on both sides of the issue. Since we last met, several important legal developments have occurred over the past year, resulting in the need for Bermuda to take a closer look at a legal framework for same-sex couples. The first involved a case that was brought to the Supreme Court, A and B versus the Director of Child and Family Services, et al. The facts of the case are that 2 same-sex persons applied for permission from the Department of Child and Family Services to adopt a child. Permission was denied as the Adoption of Children Act 2006 did not allow unmarried couples to adopt. Since Bermuda does not recognize same-sex marriage, the Adoption of Children Act 2006 indirectly banned same-sex couples from joint adoption. The February 2015 ruling was in favor of the plaintiffs, meaning that unmarried couples, including same-sex couples, can now adopt. The court found that there was discrimination on the grounds of marital status, which is a protected ground under the Human Rights Act 1981, in that 2 unmarried people were unable to jointly adopt a child. Moving on now to the European Convention on Human Rights, the Convention and the European Court. Bermuda is deemed to be a member state, having signed onto the convention through the UK, and is obligated to the conditions contained therein. In the case and judgment of Oliaria versus Italy, the court concluded that there had been a violation of Article 8 of the European Convention, and that Italy should introduce possibility of legal recognition for same-sex couples. The court believed that civil union or registered partnership would be most appropriate way for same-sex couples to have their relationship legally recognized. Same-sex couples in Italy had no satisfactory legal avenue to achieve recognition of their relationships, including civil unions or registered partnerships. The second also involved a case that was brought to the Supreme Court, Bermuda Bread Company versus the Minister of Home Affairs and the Attorney General. Legal action was brought by Bermuda Bread Company against both the Minister of Home Affairs and the Attorney General. The Bermuda Bread Company argued that the Immigration Act had to be read in conjunction with the Human Rights Act, which does not allow discrimination on the grounds of marital status or sexual orientation. The ruling issued by the Bermuda Supreme Court on the 27th of November 2015 in favor of the Bermuda Bread Company means that individuals in same-sex partnerships with Bermudians are now guaranteed the same rights to reside and seek employment in Bermuda as persons with spouses. The effect of the decision is that the non-Bermudian same-sex partners of Bermudians who are in committed relationships are entitled to live and work in Bermuda without immigration restriction. The court set 29th of February 2016 as the date by which this judgment would be effective. Therefore, the question was, what is the government's position and what legislation do we propose? Let me also say that we have as our guide the Human Rights Act of 1981, and it's important that you are aware, I read the European Convention on Human Rights, but the preamble to our Human Rights Act of 1981, whereas recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable rights of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world, and is in accord with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as proclaimed by the United Nations, and whereas the European Convention on Human Rights applies to Bermuda, and whereas the Constitution of Bermuda enshrines the fundamental rights and freedoms of every person, whatever his race, place of origin, political opinions, color, or creed, or sex, but subject to respect for the rights and freedoms of others and for the public interest. And whereas these rights and freedoms have been confirmed by a number of enactments within the legislature, and whereas it is expedient to make better provision to affirm these rights and freedoms and to protect the rights of all members of the community. Against this backdrop, the considerations of the petitioners and submissions were evaluated. Before I hand over to the Attorney General, my honorable colleague, to give you a flavor of what a civil union act would look like, there are some things that I do wish you to know. That is, that the Matrimonial Causes Act will remain in place. There will be legislation tabled such that Section 15 of the Matrimonial Causes Act will continue to define marriage as being between a man and a woman, and there will be a carve-out clause which will enable that segment to have supremacy with respect to the Human Rights Act. With that having been said, I would like to invite my honorable colleague, the Honorable Attorney General Trevor Moniz, to the podium.
Good evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out this evening for this very important subject. This first slide of my presentation deals with civil partnership in the UK. Looking quickly at the UK law, the British government passed their Civil Partnership Act in 2004, which came into effect on the 5th of December of 2005, and also affected Scotland, Wales, and Northern Ireland. The Civil Partnership Act deals with the breakdown of same-sex relations and the financial consequences of such breakdown. It has provisions for the dissolution, nullity, separation, and presumption of death orders for civil partnerships, which mirror the provisions governing the end to marriage. It is of note that Northern Ireland was the first UK jurisdiction to introduce civil partnerships, and unlike the UK, Northern Ireland has not introduced same-sex marriage and is unlikely to do so. Slide 8 is civil partnership within British Overseas Territories and UK Crown dependencies. Looking now at civil partnerships in UK Overseas Territories, in the Isle of Man, same-sex civil partnership commenced on the 6th of April 2011. It was decided in 2014 that same-sex marriages performed in England and Wales, as well as other relationships performed outside of the Isle of Man, would be treated as civil partnerships. The island of Jersey commenced same-sex civil partnerships on the 2nd of April of 2012. Civil partnerships have also been available to same-sex and opposite-sex couples in Gibraltar since the 28th of March 2014. And the tiny British Overseas Territory of Pitcairn, home to just 45 people, passed a law allowing same-sex marriage and civil partnership in Pitcairn in 2015. A civil union in Bermuda. I'm now going to present the details of the proposal to introduce civil unions into Bermuda. The questions are, what is it, who is it for, and can a civil union service be performed in Bermuda? A civil union, if the proposed legislation were tabled and passed, would be legally recognized relationship for same-sex couples only. There's not a proposal to have different-sex couples have civil unions. It would provide same-sex couples legal recognition to obtain a variety of rights and responsibilities, such as property rights, pension benefits, insurance recognition, next of kin rights in hospitals, obviously inheritance rights, etc. A civil union could be formalized by the Registrar General, or Deputy Registrar in the presence of two witnesses, but in addition, a civil union could be formalized before a civil union celebrant, also in the presence of two witnesses. A celebrant could also formalize a civil union on a Bermuda-registered ship. Under our proposals, couples will have to meet the legal requirement of being 18 years of age at the time of a civil union. The next slide, a civil union in Bermuda. Will same-sex marriages performed in other jurisdictions be recognized in Bermuda? A same-sex marriage and certain other overseas relationships, such as civil unions, civil partnerships, etc., will only be recognized in Bermuda as a civil union. Furthermore, it will only be recognized once it is registered with the Registrar General. What is the difference between civil unions and same-sex marriage? It is important to emphasize that the European Court, in the case of Oliari, calls for a form of legal relationship in the absence of marriage, which recognizes basic needs fundamental to a relationship between a same-sex couple in a stable and committed relationship, such as the mutual rights and obligations they have towards each other, including moral and material support, maintenance obligations, and inheritance rights. It is also important that Bermuda protects itself and its laws from further court cases, both locally and internationally. To those ends, many of the rights and obligations familiar to those in a marriage will be recognizable when considering the proposed civil union. Having said this, there will remain important differences. Marriage is for opposite-sex couples only. Civil union will be for same-sex couples only. Marriage is available to 16 and 17-year-olds with the consent of their parents and guardians. Civil unions will be only for those who are 18 years and over. An overseas marriage is automatically recognized in Bermuda. An overseas relationship, which includes a same-sex marriage, will only be recognized in Bermuda when it is registered with the Registrar General. Separate registers will be maintained for marriage officers and for civil union celebrants. Marriage officers will be protected from having to perform civil unions unless they choose to separately register as celebrants. What would you need to do to have a civil union in Bermuda? Same-sex couples will have to issue a notice to the Registrar General of the intended civil union. Their notice will be published and a certificate issued within the required period. During this time, the intended civil union will be publicly notified, and individuals with objections to the proposed civil union can make this objection known to the registrar. On what grounds can an objection be made to a civil union? Objections would deal with whether a civil union is lawful or not. For example, are the intended parties old enough? Are they already married or in a civil union with someone else? The objections would then be heard by a judge who decides to confirm or reject the objection. A civil union in Bermuda. What does the dissolution of a civil union look like? The dissolution of a civil union will follow the same procedures as a filing for divorce. This will involve making appropriate maintenance for civil union partners and considering the welfare of any children to the union. Will members of the clergy have to perform civil unions? We will write into the legislation religious protections so that clergy will not be required to perform civil unions unless he or she chooses to do so and has registered as a celebrant. Clergy who wish to be registered as a celebrant can register with the Registry General. The registration is separate from that of a marriage officer. A member of clergy can register as a marriage officer and/or celebrant. What is the process of becoming a civil union celebrant? Anyone seeking to serve as a civil union celebrant would register in the first place with the Registrar General. Once satisfied the application and complete, it would be forwarded to the minister. If he is satisfied that the application is appropriate, a license is then issued to the applicant to be a celebrant. How will this impact immigration? Immigration was at the center of the Bermuda Bread case. The result of that case is that same-sex partners will be able to work without a work permit in Bermuda, provided they are in a permanent relationship with a Bermudian. This is the law as currently stated and will remain the case, regardless of whether any civil union legislation is passed by Parliament or not. The legislation would set up a formal framework for the finding of the Chief Justice in that case. Overseas couples who are in an overseas relationship must first register the relationship with the Registrar General before the union is recognized under Bermuda law. Otherwise, such individuals will have to rely on the minister's discretion to land individuals who have formed a genuine and subsisting relationship with a Bermudian. What happens next? You will recall that the Chief Justice's declaration in the Bermuda Bread case comes into effect on the 29th of February of 2016. It is government's intention to table legislation in the House before that date. The proposed civil union legislation will conform with Bermuda's international legal obligations, namely that there should be a legal framework recognizing same-sex relationships. I reiterate, this government has no intention of allowing same-sex marriage to become law in Bermuda, and we will ensure this by ensuring that the Marriage Act and the Matrimonial Causes Act have primacy over the Human Rights Act in that regard. Now, one question I'd like to address here, a question has been floating around of why the government and the Attorney General didn't appeal the Bermuda Bread case. And the answer to that is very simple. We would be absolutely certain to lose any such appeal, and it would be a waste of the court's time, and we would be punished appropriately in costs. And that is the end of my presentation, and we can move on to, I think, a question period.
Moderator, ministers, thank you for giving us the opportunity to speak with you this evening. So my personal opinion is that this doesn't go far enough. But that said, I have a question for the Attorney General, if you can take one. You spoke earlier, and the pamphlets outline what the perceived differences are between a marriage and a civil union in Bermuda. Can you go into further what the pathways to status are for the non-Bermudian who's in a civil union with a Bermudian?
Is that the end of your question?
Oh, I might have a part two, depending what he says.
Do you want to share it right now? Because I want to make sure you have your full 2 minutes.
Well, no, I mean, if it doesn't, then why not? Is there any possibility that the legislation could be amended to take that into consideration? If it's a yes, I'll just sit down.
Okay.
Yeah, the answer is yes to that. The rights would be, the same.
Through and through, just the only just the name difference, and that it has to be registered once it comes to the island.
Right.
All right, thank you. Thank
Okay.
you, Moderator.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Good evening, thank you. I had 3 questions, 2 questions now. Celebrants, in order to get a license before as a marriage officer for someone like me, who doesn't have a church here, it was a one-off. Every time I was going to perform a ceremony, it was a one-off. So I'd have to reapply every time. Is that going to be the same for a celebrant? That's question 1. And you said that in order to have appealed that decision of the judge, that you would have been sure to lose. If you could elaborate on that so people understand exactly why that was the case.
Yes, certainly. With respect to the first question, I think the intention is to have a broader category. So, because the feeling is that a lot of people who are marriage officers will not be willing to be celebrants, that in order then to have a sufficient pool of celebrants, that you would then open it on a wider basis. So I think that someone like yourself would be quite able to get a celebrant license. You wouldn't need to have a church. You'd be able to get a license. So that's my thinking on that. Sorry, the second question was, to speak to the legal obligations have been evolving. So in the European Union, everyone, I guess, is aware that in the United States, through an action of the Supreme Court, they moved on a federal basis towards same-sex marriage. Up until that time, the individual states were moving at their own pace in their own direction. So some states had done nothing, some had same-sex unions, some had same-sex marriage. But then eventually the Supreme Court stepped in and made a decision that it was a constitutional right, which was a little bit of a controversial decision. In the UK, at that time, you had after their move to civil partnerships, which are only open to same-sex partners, they then had Prime Minister Cameron, who was very keen on it, and moved the country to same-sex marriages. But in Europe, generally they're governed by the European Convention. Now what governs there, the European Convention was created after the Second World War. It gives a right to family life. And the law in that area and the interpretation of the European Convention has been evolving. So that just a few years ago, there was no such right to same-sex marriage. There was the earlier case, I think, of Schalke, which had a general statement. But it wasn't until the case of Oliari recently that said the states had to give some definitive recognition to same-sex partners in committed relationships. So that was a direction. Now, they didn't direct as to how you had to do it. They didn't say you had to have civil unions or same-sex marriages or whatever, but they said you must recognize those relationships. Now, in our situation, the Chief Justice has made it clear that if we don't do that, then he will rewrite the law judicially to do that, because he says because he says we are out of step with the provision in our Human Rights Act, and we are out of step with the European Convention as interpreted by the Oliari case. So if we don't do anything, it will be done for us.
Thank you. Sir?
Good evening.
Good evening.
When the OBA MP Wayne Scott introduced the 2 words and a comma making sexual orientation equal to race, it was stated that this would not lead to same-sex marriage. It was then stated in the House of Assembly by the opposition PLP that we should fortify marriage with supremacy clauses. This was put down by the Attorney General at the time, MP Mark Pettingill, stating that it was not necessary. The same one who is now challenging his own government's Registrar General to marry a same-sex couple, and yet is still allowed by the OBA to serve as a backbencher. Can you explain, I've got 3 questions. Can you explain why your cabinet will still have Mr. Pettingill serve on the OBA? That's one question. The second question is, why won't we allow the many to make this choice as opposed to a Chief Justice? That's 2. And 3, Madam Minister made the statement on Tuesday that the government has not introduced anything or made a decision. Is that still standing even tonight as a public statement?
Thank you.
I'm happy to address that. The question of Mr. Pettingill is completely irrelevant. I mean, what the minister at the time said was that this would not lead to same-sex marriage, and we are not introducing same-sex marriage and have no intention to do so. And the idea is that we will fortify and protect marriage for a man and a woman, but we will also propose the idea of a civil union. Now, if the civil union legislation comes to the House, it's almost certain that that's going to be a conscience vote. So whether that passes or fails is a question of how the individual members vote. But at the end of the day, if it doesn't pass, then the Chief Justice's ruling is still in place, and he will act accordingly, as is his job. Now, that's the first question. Now, your second question was, I think, was probably a reference to a referendum. You were saying, why not allow people to make a decision? It's simply not appropriate here because we're talking about legal rights. We're talking about human rights. So we can't put out to a referendum, would you like to abide by your legal obligations or not? You have to abide by your obligations. And it's our job as a government to put forward the most acceptable way to do that. So what we're trying to do is to recognize people's opinions and at the same time to abide by our legal obligations. So that's why it's not suitable for referendum.
And if I may, I'd like to answer the question. I'd like to answer the question that you put to me, and that is my comment on Tuesday that the government has never indicated that it would redefine marriage, was what my comment was. And that has not changed. In fact, it is our intention to table legislation which will actually fortify the Matrimonial Causes Act, Section 15, subsection 1, and to put an additional subsection 2, and that legislation will be tabled in the House of Assembly Friday next, not tomorrow, but Friday next.
And I know I'm cutting close my time, but are you going to be able to do those fortifications before the Chief Justice timetable of February 29th? Is that going to happen?
That is certainly the intention.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you. Before you go, I have some cards, so I'll just read a couple of questions. What is considered a permanent relationship with a partner for purposes of civil union? And I'll read a second one. Why are we making more ways to separate people as shown in this fact sheet? And there was a fact sheet that's been given out this evening.
If I can speak to the first question there, you only have to figure out what makes a permanent relationship if you don't have civil union framework. If you don't have the legislative framework, then you have to figure out if someone comes in and they must have rights at immigration, same-sex couple, if they say they're in a permanent relationship, they have to produce evidence to that effect. So they would have to produce evidence that they live together, that they shared bank accounts, that they were in a permanent relationship. And that would be at the vagaries of producing some sort of evidence by way of an affidavit. But if you create the framework of a civil union, then you can simply say, if you have a registered civil union, then that will be accepted as your permanent relationship.
And the second question was, why are we making more ways to separate people as shown in this fact sheet? I don't know if you want to answer.
I guess I'm not quite sure of the actual question, what, you know.
I mean, I don't know whether that question is meant to mean why we don't introduce same-sex marriage in terms of having the two different regimes, but I think everybody understands why that's the appropriate way to proceed.
Thank you. Okay, one at a time. If you have a comment, please step to the mic. Minister, did you finish answering? Did you have anything else to add?
Yeah, I mean, all I can tell you, you know, we live subject to democracy, so what we're trying to do is abide by our legal obligations. If we went to the House of Assembly, certainly with anything more, it would absolutely fail. If we go with a civil union, we will see whether it passes or not.
Okay, thank you. Ma'am?
Good evening. My question is in regards to human rights and equal opportunities. And you have said that it is important for this government to protect themselves. But yet, you've stated here tonight that the civil unions will be between same-sex couples only. How does this justify not giving heterosexuals who have been fighting for the same rights all these years those same opportunities and rights without discriminating?
The answer to that one is very simple. What the law looks at are the principles involved. So it breaks down, so it says, you know, do you have a right of inheritance? Do you have a right to the pension, you know, rights of your spouse? Do you have all of those rights? And the answer to all of those questions will be yes.
So then why not open it up to heterosexuals as well who have been fighting for the same rights?
Yeah. Well, let me just speak to this. I mean, this same disagreement has arisen in the United Kingdom, where, you know, they have a regime of civil partnerships for same-sex couples, and they had traditional marriage for opposite-sex couples. They now have same-sex marriage, but they still have the civil partnerships still exist, and people still take advantage of it. And there is a recent court case where an opposite-sex couple sued so they could have a civil partnership. Of course, I think they were law professors, so they wanted a civil partnership, and they demanded that right. They lost their case in court because the court said you can get married, which gives you all of those same rights, so you're not losing any rights. But the judge in the High Court in London gave them permission to appeal, and we are very closely following that to see what happens. So, so far we've made a policy decision to keep them separate, but we're certainly going to follow developments on that point.
Sir, please go.
Yeah, thank you. Wayne Ferber, for Member of Parliament for Hamilton West. Ministers, it's very interesting that you talk about a conscious vote, which tells me that you don't have support within your own caucus. That's first of all. Let me ask the question, is the conscious vote also for ministers, or is it just for your backbenchers? First question. Second, it has always been said that the Parliament is supreme. You remember the MacDonald issue when we took the Privy Council as far as Parliament, the Privy Council ruling that Parliament is supreme. How in the world does the Chief Justice overrule the government in the Parliament?
Well, I mean, I guess the answer to that is simple. We amended the Human Rights Act to...
No, I asked the question, how does because it allows Parliament, U.S. ministers, can bring a bill which can stop the Chief Justice from doing something.
The situation here is we amended the Human Rights Act two years ago or so to introduce this, right? In the sense that you no longer allow any sort of discrimination. Now, what you're suggesting is we could go back and we could remove that amendment and go back to the position before. We could, you know, technically Parliament could do that, but it would look pretty bad if it did so. You would be removing equal rights from people. It would be in breach of our obligations under the European Convention. It would be in breach of the obligations as expressed by the European Court of Justice in Schalke, in Oliari, etc. So we would be in breach of our legal obligations. It wouldn't last long. It wouldn't be a good decision. It wouldn't be acceptable to remove rights from people in that way. You know, you're saying, is it possible? You know, a lot of things are possible, but you wouldn't dream of doing them. It would be a retrograde step in our society to consider doing that, and I don't think it would be acceptable.
Yes. The question I have is the legal briefs from the ADF that you received says that there is no legal obligation to promote civil unions in the European Court of Human Rights. So my question is, in the event that you do push for civil unions, why not make it contingent on enshrining marriages between a man and a woman in your constitution, like the Cayman Islands, to give the kind of assurance to those of your people here who wish to preserve marriage, the traditional definition, because there's overwhelming evidence to show that civil unions is the first step for changing marriage, the definition of marriage. So why not provide those securities like the Cayman Islands?
Yeah, I mean, that's not something we've considered, and I don't think as a government is the way we would propose to go.
Okay, thank you. I'm going to read some more cards before we go to the next speaker. Is there any mechanism in place for same-sex couples to have coverage under the law as it is today, able to rent, have insurance coverage, status to one or the other? And I'll read the next question. What about those who, due to such things as religious beliefs, are not comfortable performing services for same-sex events? Will they be able to not perform such services with no penalty?
Yes, let me just say that the intent, as we propose it for the Civil Union Act, is that in order for a civil union to be celebrated, there would have to be a celebrant. That celebrant would, in fact, have to register as a celebrant. So it would not be an automatic thing that if you are a pastor, you would have to provide the services for that same-sex, same-gender couple. So you would have to make a specific application to be a celebrant. In order to make that application, that in and of itself would suggest that you were willing to do so.
Excellent. And the second question?
Was that about the service?
Mechanism for same-sex couples to have coverage under the law as it is today, able to rent, have insurance coverage, status to one or the other.
There will be all the same rights. All the rights would be equal.
And those are currently enshrined in the Human Rights Act.
Good evening. Imagine that. A few months ago, I came up to the mic and I said I want to get married in my own country. And people stopped me on the street from various religions and told me it would be a cool day in hell. Imagine just a couple of months later, the prospect is on my doorstep. And I just want to say bravo to the government for recognizing that I am a human being entitled to the right to love and marry who I want in my country. I think that is a progressive step for our country. It's long overdue, long overdue. I have had to endure all kinds of personal attacks as a person, regardless of the fact that I pay taxes, regardless of the fact that I'm a law-abiding citizen, and regardless of the fact that I don't get to say what happens in your house. I don't get to say who you love. But everybody thinks they have the right to determine what happens in my house. And I think that civil unions don't go far enough, but I'll take it. You know why I'll take it? Because when I get sick in the hospital, I want my partner to have a say what happens to me and not a stranger. When I pay my insurance coverage,
90
I want it to
seconds.
go to my partner. And that is long overdue. And I'm glad that we've made a compromise because I don't want to get married in any church. And I think they're protected under the Human Rights Act just like everybody else. Religion is protected. And whatever they want to do in their establishments, it's okay with me. But I have the right to go to a registrar, and I have a right to go to a person who is now registered to be able to marry me, and I'm good with that.
Thank you.
So I just want to applaud the government for finally stepping up.
Thank you very much. Sir, you may start.
Thank you. I just wanted a little bit of clarity because I'm hearing about how they'll, willing to take a compromise. It almost sounds like a stopgap for now. And I just want you to clarify a little bit for me about the fact that, all the other countries took civil unions to the next step. If this is a permanent fix for this, why did it not work in any of the other countries, including England? And if this is such a permanent step, and if it can never be challenged again, can you clarify why that would happen versus putting it in a constitution, which you said was completely out of the question? Which one of those two mechanisms would definitely guarantee this would never be challenged in law again, regardless of who was to bring that challenge up?
Thank you.
Well, sir, there's no guarantee that it will never be brought up again, even were it put into the Constitution. There is no permanent guarantee. All I can say is, we're doing the best that we are able to do in terms of guaranteeing traditional marriage, but we can't guarantee it forever. If you put it in the Constitution, it wouldn't. That's not necessarily permanent either. The Constitution can be changed like any other document. So.
Thank you. I'm just going to read another question on a card. Will there be any impact on the education curriculum to teach about same-sex matters? And if so, will partners be allowed to have their children not participate in such sessions if what is taught goes against their religious beliefs?
The education minister is not present, neither is the home affairs minister, but I could say that what I believe to be the intent. I think that the school curriculum has been set. I don't envisage that this particular topic is likely to be introduced into a standard school curriculum, but that is something that would absolutely remain to be seen. And I would certainly say that parents and families would have the right to determine whether their children are subjected to information that may be disseminated in a class environment to which they have objection. They would have the right to withdraw their children from that environment, I would imagine.
And one more. Will civil unions be considered for multiple persons of same sex?
No.
Ma'am?
Evening, everyone. Just if I could get some clarification from what was said earlier regarding civil unions must be registered with the Register General for overseas people coming in. However, that is not needed for heterosexual couples now, am I correct?
Yes, so there is a reciprocal recognition of marriages in certain places. So
Okay.
those are automatically recognized, and that's not the proposal for civil unions.
So for civil unions, for overseas people coming in, they would need to register with the Registrar General
would
in order to get equal rights?
Yes, they would register.
Okay. So to me, that's discriminatory to have it for one section of the public and not the other. And the fact that you're creating a list, which with propaganda being sent out through social networking medias today, would propose a list that, if it got into the wrong hands, could create hate crimes in Bermuda for people. And to me, that's a dangerous situation to create. If you're going to ask for people to register with the Registrar General, it should be for everyone and not just a specific group of people coming into the island. And the fact is, to please, I would just ask, before creating that list, consider the hate crimes that could come out of it if it did get into the wrong hands. We've seen it around the world with other countries where people are targeted for different things. I have reviewed in detail the video that was placed online to keep marriage as it is.
90 seconds.
And I must say I found it very full of propaganda, and there was a lot of hate in it, and things that did not pertain to this subject, as I would say the education side of it does not pertain to this evening. Will benefits, you've answered that. As far as clarity on the work permit not needed for a union to a Bermudian, am I correct in saying it will follow the same as it is now for regular couples? Because
Thank you.
there's an
Yes,
hour,
correct.
there's a year space or something. You said that none was needed, so I
No,
just
there's
wanted
not
to
a- no,
clarify that.
There's not a year's
Okay.
space. It's in a period of a year, I think, is when you come in and you have a fiance, they can come here for up to a year.
But it would
Before
follow
marriage.
that.
But once you're married, the policy is you get what's called a spouse's letter. So
Okay.
you get a spouse's letter. In terms of registering a civil union, it's certainly not going to be onerous to do. I take on board what you say, but my personal view is that once the emotion of the period we're in now passes, I think Bermudians will return to their very respectful behavior. I don't foresee violence in the community. If I did, I'd be surprised, but we would certainly monitor that and take appropriate action if it did occur.
Okay, thank you.
Thank you very much. I'll read another question. There was a case in Australia where the spouse of a same-sex that was visiting Australia died, and the surviving spouse was denied a death certificate because Australia does not recognize same-sex marriage.
Well, and that's a more complicated legal question, but if someone's just visiting a country, you've got to look at what law is controlling that event. You look at someone's personal law, and if they come from Germany or something, their personal law is German. You look at German law to see what it recognizes. So, I'm not saying that you can't get unusual situations. I mean, we've looked at this. In the United Kingdom, for example, the Civil Union Act was probably 500 pages. Here we are in a relatively short period of time trying to put together something that will work and will satisfy a substantial majority of Bermudians. Is it going to be perfect from the very beginning? That's highly unlikely, but we'll certainly do the best we can. As to anomalous situations that arise, we will certainly try our very best to address them, and I can put that down on the list for the draftsman to examine.
All right, I have a second question. If same-sex marriages performed in other jurisdictions will only be recognized after it is registered with the Registrar General, will same-sex couples that visit the island lose their rights as a married couple once they set foot on the island?
No, absolutely not. But, there are some, again, situations that arise that even you have people living here who were married somewhere else. Let's say people here were married in Japan. Whether those people who are living here want to, if they decide to divorce, whether they want to exercise their rights under Bermuda law, if they've been resident for more than a year, they can get a divorce here. But even those people have to make a decision. If they're a Japanese couple, do we want to return to Japan to get divorced, or do we want to get divorced in Bermuda? and in a couple, one might choose one and one might choose the other, and you get dueling jurisdictions. But that's just real life, and those complicated events occur.
Thank you very much. Ma'am? Okay, sir.
Good evening, everyone. Thank you for being here, government. I would like for you all to consider doing a hate crime for legislation to be legislated into law. That is something that I feel that it's pertinent in this country, just for many things across the board. I really think that that should be a law legislated for the protection of the gay and lesbian community. Thank you.
Thank you for that question. I believe we are broadening the provisions of the Human Rights Act to cover some of those situations.
Good evening. I think it may be a little disingenuous to say that the government wants to institute civil unions and at the same time protect marriage, when we know it's undeniable that governments, and especially 19 out of 20 countries that now have same-sex marriage went the way of civil unions. And there are 4 countries or territories that you listed: Isle of Man, Jersey, Gibraltar, Pitcairn. I believe that Gibraltar may have adopted same-sex marriage. So I don't know what precedent you're using. They didn't? Okay, well, I don't know what precedent you're using, but the majority of the countries that we know of have had same-sex civil marriage or civil unions have adopted same-sex marriage. In light of that, Mr. Moniz, you said that we all live subject to democracy. Well, the European Court of Human Rights agrees with you, and their position on adopting same-sex marriage, and even though you're talking about civil unions tonight, we know that civil unions is a stepping stone to same-sex marriage. And their position on that was, it says the European Court of Human Rights, in discussing the role of the judiciary when considering same-sex marriage in Europe, stated, as matters stand, the question whether or not to allow same-sex marriage is left to regulation by the national law of the contracting state. In that connection, the court observes, this is the European Court of Human Rights, which you keep quoting, said the court observes that marriage has deep-rooted social and cultural connotations which may differ largely from one society to another. The court reiterates that it must not rush to substitute its own judgment in place of that of national authorities who are best placed to assess and respond to the needs of our society. And also, just going back to, again, 30% of the electorate have spoken, and we need to know.
Thank you, ma'am.
Yeah.
With respect to the lady there, the European Court cases have moved on, and where we have to give some recognition to these same-sex couples. I mean, let me just say that my own experience from being involved as long ago as what was called the Stubbs Bill back in 1994 on decriminalizing male homosexual activity back then, it was very, very tense atmosphere, and there were a lot of meetings that took place. There was a lot of stress, there was a lot of emotion. The bill was eventually passed with an amendment from myself, which seemed to keep both sides happy. It was a conscience vote on both sides of the House. The bill passed, and I was told at the time, this is, you just got elected and this is the end of your political career, this is the end of this, that, and the other. But the temperature went down very quickly after that, and Bermudians got back to their respectful and polite behavior, and we really had no problems as a result. So I think there's nothing to be afraid of. I say there's nothing to be afraid of. We're putting our cards on the table in terms of what we're doing. We recognize to some degree that it's a compromise, but we think it's the best way to go. It's the best thing to do for everyone in this community.
Thank you. Sir?
Good evening. I know that MP Ferbert talked a bit about supremacy and some of those details. Could you explain again how the European Convention of Human Rights relates to legislation in Bermuda, and could you explain what would happen if Bermuda were an independent country rather than an overseas territory?
Well, I mean, what happens here, you know, we have signed on, you know, as an associated state to the European Convention. It guarantees a right to family life. As I said, those cases have progressed from Schauke, which was in 2010, to Oliari in 2015. We've signed on to that, and those guarantees are made. We could change our law locally, as Mr. Ferbert has said. We could change our law. We could go back to what it was. I don't think that would be healthy. It certainly wouldn't meet our obligations under the European Convention. The general rule with the European Convention is you must exhaust your remedies in the courts. Once you exhaust those remedies, you could then take a case to the European Court of Justice. And you know, you would win that decision at the end of the day. And does Bermuda really want to be seen as being out of step, as not giving people the rights which they should have? All we're talking about is giving people their basic human rights required by international convention and required by law.
Thank you.
Could you just address and for the record, I support same-sex marriage, but could you explain what would change if Bermuda were independent?
Thank you. Thank you.
Well, nothing would change if Bermuda were independent. Nothing would change.
I have another question.
Just before you go to that
go ahead.
question, if I may, just to complete the response to the lady who had asked earlier concerning the shock and cough case and the decision that she articulated in your comments. That case was a 2010 case, and as happens in legal jurisdictions and legal parlance, precedent is established and then new cases come up. The Oliari versus Italy is a 2015 decision, so it's 5 years later than the case to which you referred and the decision that was handed down at that time.
Okay, thank you. Will persons who do not feel comfortable providing business-related services such as providing cakes, floral services, photography service, etc., will they be able to not do so without penalty?
Well, I mean, the situation here is that, you know, under the law, you're entitled to your rights. You have to provide equal services, so you can't refuse services to people. But you know, what you generally find is that people want to deal with people who want to deal with them. They want happy relationships with people they deal with. It's like marriages. Who would want to go to a church who didn't want you there and to ask you to celebrate your union that they didn't want to celebrate? You want people with you who enjoy what you're doing, who respect you. So I can't imagine anything else happening with respect to those sorts of services.
Thank you. Sir?
Yes, good evening, everyone. Thank you. I certainly appreciate the transparency and the opportunity to have this conversation. Just two basic questions. The first question, of course, when an individual couple are interested in getting married, they will fill out an application with the Registry General, and that situation is gazetted for the application before it's approved. Would that be a similar situation for civil unions?
Yes, yes.
The other question, I was glad that someone got back to it. I thought we had perhaps missed it, and that was the question that just preceded my question about whether or not, in the event that services were going to be refused in a case where a celebration was being conducted, would there be any negative repercussions regarding that?
I'm not quite sure. Were you talking about celebration of a union?
No, he's talking about somebody doing flowers or cakes or something
Oh,
for same-sex
okay.
couple.
I mean, if you wanted to insist on, you know, a floral service providing flowers who didn't want to, you would be in your legal right. You make a complaint to the human rights people. But, you know, generally you want to deal with people who want to deal with you. So generally it's not going to arise.
So potentially a situation could be considered where if services were refused for someone who was seeking
Yes.
to not service someone?
Yes, yeah. If you were providing a service to the public and you refused to provide it to someone on the basis they were in a same-sex relationship, if they wanted to make a complaint to the human rights, they could make a complaint and they would succeed. But in most cases, that would not happen. So that's...
All right, one last question, if I have time.
Okay, this last one.
Beyond this particular conversation tonight and the one on Monday, will the public still be able to make submissions to yourselves, perhaps through a website or an email? I thought I saw one up on the screen earlier today. That's
Yes,
it?
Yes.
Okay, thank you.
We will ensure that the information in terms of your submissions, that it will be put up on the slides at the end of the presentation, so you'll know what address to which you can send any queries or concerns that you might have.
Thank you.
Thank
You're
you.
welcome.
Sir?
Hello. So I'm a software developer, and I just wanted to say, with these online petitions, the numbers, you can't believe them at all. It's so easy to make a bot to create as many signees as you'd like. And I don't know whether that has gone on or not. Also, they might not even be from here. They might be from anywhere. Obviously, they're a great idea in principle, but using the statistics of things like this so regularly, it's a bit worrying to me. Thank you.
Thank you.
May I just respond to that? And I just like...
That's on both sides. I'm not trying.
Yes, let me just respond to that. And as a government, when a petition is presented, we assume good intentions. So if somebody says that I have a 2,500 signature petition, are we going to go and check every single one? If somebody says that they have a 6,000 or 8,000 signature petition, are we going to go and check each and every one? The answer is no, because we are going to assume good intentions, and we are going to assume that those people who present petitions believe that the signatories thereto are accurate and are legitimate. So, we may not, so if you have a 6,000 signature petition and 4,000 are legitimate, does that negate the petition? Similarly, on a smaller number. So we have to assume good intentions in the absence of any other information.
Okay, but if they're getting them from online and they're assuming good intentions, that's anybody in the world.
Well, we take your point. We take your point. There's always a grain of salt there.
Thank you.
Good evening. First, I just want to start off by saying thank you for having this conversation, for recognizing that just because I love differently, I am also a person, and I might want to spend the rest of my life with someone too. So thank you for that. I do have a question. I don't know if it's car park, but it has to do with children and the hospital. I know you're saying that we may get the same legal rights as our counterparts, but should my girlfriend and I choose to have a child, is it possible that the hospital may discriminate against me when it comes to parenting time, or will I have to go the roundabout way and adopt my own child, or could the birth certificates be amended, like in some other countries, to suggest parent 1 and 2, which leaves it open, as opposed to mother and father? That's it.
Thank you.
Yeah, I'm not quite sure we understand the detail of that question, but I'm just saying, again, I think that's one of those things which we will get to as we move along. But as far as we're able, we're going to treat civil unions exactly the same as married couple in terms of the legal rights that occur as a result.
Right. We're just saying that question came about is because I want to know, will I have legal rights to my personal child?
Yes, absolutely, the same rights. Yes.
Okay.
Thank
Thank you. Sir?
Thank you. Yeah, I worked at Marine Corps for 41 years, 37 and a half years as a tugboat captain, retired 2007. And all those years I worked very diligently, and somebody saw fit for me to receive the Queen's Certificate in Bed of Honor because of my service to the marine industry. But when it came to my private life, of course, I had to be particularly careful. Somebody on the job asked me many years ago when I was still working, has management approached you about being gay? I said, no, why would it? I'll have the management in court. That would be discrimination. I'm doing my work as long as I don't interfere with anybody else, nobody else's business. If they're going to do that, they better start asking questions about married men who were having affairs. It's a very private thing, it's nobody's business. As long as I respected employees and everybody else and did my job, not a problem. Now, I've been involved in a long-distance relationship with someone who lives on one of the islands to the south of Bermuda for 7 years. And we constantly talk about getting married. I like the idea of marriage equality. But as the lady said earlier, I'll have to settle for civil unions. So I am delighted that this government, this particular government, and incidentally, I was a progressive Labor Party supporter for all my life until 2012, when the Progressive Labor Party kept on ducking this subject of sexual orientation or addressing the subject of homosexual concern in Bermuda. So this government here, I felt kind of comfortable that it would have the fortitude to deal with this particular topic. So I'm elated and delighted that we are where we are right now. So I can foresee civil unions in the future. I'm not fighting about marriage equality. That would be nice, but I'd be certainly happy if we can win civil union. Thank you very much.
Sir.
Good evening, everyone. As with many other people, I'm very glad that you guys are tabling something. As a person who actually did vote for the OVA, I'm actually disappointed that it took a legal status or legal challenge to bring this about. I would have hoped that you and the other side of the House as well would be professional and adults to move this country forward and not hold us back. But at least we are making progress, so I'm glad that you have brought it forward. The one thing I do request is, for both sides of the House and anyone that speaks publicly, is have a conscience of what you say, because it does have an impact on children. I remember when the Stubbs bill came out, I was a young child and was struggling with, how do I feel? I heard from my parents, this is wrong, this is wrong. You hear it around society, and you don't know how it has an effect on people. So if the government could take the charge and pastors and other people and say, you know what, it's a good thing to love other people, let's move society forward and show it in a positive light. You don't know, you could save someone's life in the future.
Thank you. Ma'am?
Similarly, along the same topic of children, the question is, what about the equal and human rights of children to have a mother and father? The government says it will protect the rights of all its citizens. Does this include the youngest and voiceless citizens? Is it not the most fundamental human right to have both a mother and father? Why are we institutionalizing motherless and fatherlessness?
I don't know if you mind me stepping in on this, but it's sort of outside of my field a little bit, but in terms of, adoption, my own view is you have so many children out there, you say they have a right to a mother and father, but they don't have a mother and father. You get children out there who need to be adopted. We don't, in many cases, don't have enough people who want to be parents to an adopted child. So surely, from my point of view, it would be better to have parents who are same-sex and not to have parents at all. And that's the situation we're faced with.
Sorry, I didn't hear that final comment.
I was just stating the fact that it's more about the institutionalization of motherlessness and fatherlessness versus adoption, which is a great, option.
Well, let me just add to the AG's comment, and that is ideally, children, we have grown up traditionally in an environment where children have mothers, they have a father, they live in the family home with the 2 dogs and a picket fence and 1.5 children or 2 parents, want to have children in the white picket fence. That was what the communities looked like historically. Times have changed. We have looked at, we've been able to witness marital breakdown in which some children are just outside the arc of safety because of the attitudes of parents, heterosexual parents, one towards the other. Certainly from this government's perspective, we want to ensure that children are embraced in a loving and nurturing environment, and we have to strive towards that end.
I will give you 1 minute.
I'm back. My question's back as well. It's a human rights question. I've heard that the primacy clause within the Human Rights Act is going to be tweaked and amended to make various aspects, I guess, of either the Matrimonial Causes Act or the Marriage Act give those provisions priority over the Human Rights Act. That kind of makes me a little nervous given the quasi-constitutional nature of the Human Rights Act. What I would like clarity on is the extent to which carve-outs are going to be provided so that legislation will be outside the scope of the Human Rights Act. My view is that's a slippery slope, and my hope is that we don't carve out protection under the Human Rights Act, but what's the extent of those carve-outs?
Well, let me just say,
Thank you.
The Human Rights Act provides within itself for there to be carve-outs. So actually in the Act itself, it recognizes there are going to be carve-outs. So it's not like a carve-out is something totally unexpected. With respect to the Matrimonial Causes Act, the carve-out is only for Section 15, which says that marriage will be between a male and a female. No other aspect. It's a very, very limited carve-out. So obviously, while the Human Rights Act recognizes there will be carve-outs, we're certainly going to keep them to a minimum. This is not sort of a breach of the dam or anything of that sort.
Okay. Thank you. Any other questions?
Good evening, everyone. Before people consider me to be someone who hates homosexuals, I must clarify something. I have a son that is gay, and my son has told me that he will be marrying his partner in 2016. I can celebrate in his happiness, although I disagree with his decision. I heard this word discrimination be thrown about many times. From my understanding, discrimination is when you take two things of equal value and treat them differently. That is discrimination. They said that interracial marriage was discrimination. Yes, it was, because you have a white male or female marrying a black male or female, and marriage was between a man and a woman. So denying interracial marriage was discrimination. Right now we have a man and a man, or a female and a female, and we say it's discrimination. It can't be. Until the law is changed, then denying same-sex is discrimination. The word discrimination is when two things of equal value are treated differently.
90 seconds.
Okay, and then we look at human rights. Who has the right to determine the right of a human? Do you? Do I? No, we don't. Human rights differ from one state to another, from one jurisdiction to another. Human rights were given to us way in the beginning when we were created. The good Lord gave us freedom of will, which meant we can do whatever we want, but there are consequences. And he set out his guidelines to govern us.
Thank you, sir.
Therefore, if I was to murder someone, I am guilty, although it's my right to do it, because God gave me that right.
Thank you, sir.
But it's different.
Thank you.
To speak to that, you know, what I hear what I hear in that gentleman, I think, is fear of the unknown. I think there's a certain amount of, I don't. Yeah, I'm not being, you know, I'm not being pejorative. I recognize his views, but it's fear of the unknown, and I certainly.
One at a time, please. Please hold your sign down.
And the truth is that the situation with people is you have to recognize every individual has their rights. Whatever their choices and preferences are, you have to respect those choices and preferences, even though they're much different from your own. And the fact of the matter is the younger generation don't suffer with this. You know, my son tells me, you know, Dad, you struggle with these issues to get the right. We don't even worry about it. You know, we know this, as Minister Gordon Pamplin said, it's a very diverse world out there. And we have to recognize that all those people have rights, and they live lives that are different from our lives, but they have a right to do that.
Thank you. Just one moment. I'm going to read a statement from a card. People always bring up father and mother. There are such things as mother figures and father figures. For starters, godfathers, godmothers, auntie, uncles, granny and grandpa, teachers, and pastors.
I did mention that we want to ensure that our children are nurtured in a wholesome environment, and all of those extended families, apart from direct parents, are all a part of that healthy situation in which children can be nurtured.
Excellent. Thank you.
Good evening, everyone.
Good evening.
I want to congratulate you for what you've put forward so far. As wherever she went, disappeared. It took a huge step to get to this point. But I understand the frustration on behalf of those who not necessarily support what you've done, but at the same time, I need to ask, what would you have those in the gay community do if they love someone? Because really, we can't dictate who we're going to fall in love with. You don't know. I just want to know. I'm just asking a question. You don't have to ask it now, not necessarily you. But what would one expect those in the gay community to do when they have found someone they want to be with for the rest of their life, if they don't have any other recourse? That's all. If we can't be accepted in our country, what's the point of staying here?
Thank you very much.
Let me just make a comment and observation. I started earlier with reading the preamble to the Human Rights Act, and I think it's important to just reiterate that recognition of the inherent dignity and the equal and inalienable right of all members of the human family is the foundation of freedom, justice, and peace in the world. Now, this is in accord with the Universal Declaration of Human Rights as proclaimed by the United Nations. The European Convention on Human Rights has spoken to this issue as well. And clearly, as legislators, it is very important that we have this human rights legislation in the forefront of our thought processes when we deliberate. I can say that there are times when things occur that we personally may not agree with, but that is of absolutely no consequence when you're dealing with the entire broad spectrum of our community. So we have to make decisions that are the right thing to do. What we also don't want to see is that we create an environment in which our very vital members of our community feel so alienated that they have to leave Bermuda. That is sad, and we certainly don't want to see that. We have to embrace, I believe that we are at a crossroads between the dogma that some of us may have as our prejudices and that of compassion, which I believe some of us need to be able to embrace as a manner in which a healthy society lives. So I'm hoping, I appreciate, I don't think there were any more comments, so I think I'm just gonna sort of have these as my concluding remarks. I appreciate your coming out. I appreciate the comments that you have made and our ability to hear that which you have shared with us the angst that some of you have, the concerns that some of you have, the observations, and the support that some of you have. But know that in the final analysis, it is our intention to ensure that what we provide legislatively is not just appropriate from a political perspective, but that we do have conformity with the Human Rights Act. We did say that we were going to put in legislation, which will be tabled next week, Friday, to amend Section 15 of the Matrimonial Causes Act, and that will help to solidify the definition of marriage, which basically Section 15 effectively says that a marriage will be void if it is not between a man and a woman. And the new subsection that will be implemented will say that that section will effectively have primacy over the human rights. It's one of the small carve-outs. It's not in the Human Rights Act that the carve-out is, it's in the Matrimonial Causes Act where that carve-out will appear. And once that is debated and presumably passed by the House of Assembly, then I believe that that will give comfort to people who feel uneasy. I think lots of the jurisdictions that started out, as the lady indicated earlier, with civil unions that they say morphed into same-sex marriage, may not necessarily have taken that step in solidifying and fortifying the meaning of marriage and protecting it as being between a man and a woman. That's what we are hoping to do with the introduction of the legislation that we have coming up next week, and hopefully that legislation will succeed. But thank you very much for your input and for your engagement. And if there are any thoughts that you have that you may not have had the opportunity to articulate tonight, the website of MCCS submissions at gov.bm, it's there on the screen. Please feel free to send your comments. We had to make some decisions. We had to move, and I did hear that we might have been dishonest with people by holding a meeting tonight when we have considered legislation that would go down this particular route. Let me just say that when court cases, this is not a static situation. When matters occur that require attention of the legislature, we have to move. But we are still obligated, as I promised that I would do in September and early October, to bring our findings back to you. We wanted to make sure that we fulfilled that obligation. And we will continue these discussions, and we will continue to receive your feedback, because the legislation respecting civil unions has not been tabled. And obviously, if there are observations, comments that need to be made that can be considered, let us know. We're certainly happy to hear your comments. Thank you very much.